I never asked for gratitude, not for every check, every favor, every bill I paid when they were in trouble. I simply believed that family was about support. But one night during a family dinner, my son in law loudly mocked my cheap gifts in front of everyone. He thought I would swallow the insult. He didn't know one thing. Everything they relied on, their cars, their home, their business, existed because of my money. And in that moment, I decided it was time to change everything. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Loretta Harris, and I was 65 years old the night it all began to unravel. I lived in a modest, comfortable house just outside Boise, Idaho, the same home my late husband and I had bought together 40 years ago when dreams were bigger than our bank account and hope seemed stitched into every morning. I had been a professional bookkeeper most of my life, managing small business accounts, balancing numbers with the kind of precision that came naturally to me. After Harold passed away, I eased into retirement, spending more of my time in the garden and volunteering at the local library. I lived simply but fully, and I had always believed that my family was my richest investment. Every Sunday, it was tradition for my daughter Sarah, her husband Derek, and their two little boys to come over for dinner. It was a tradition I had insisted on keeping even when life got busier for them, even when the boys had soccer games or birthday parties to attend. Sunday night at Grandma's was supposed to be non-negotiable, a small anchor in the fast-moving current of their lives. That evening was no different, at least at first. I spent the afternoon preparing the meal: meatloaf, roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, and a lemon meringue pie for dessert. The house smelled warm and welcoming, the way it always did when something was baking. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones Harold and I had picked out together in a tiny store on our honeymoon trip to Oregon. When they arrived, the boys tumbled in first, bringing with them a gust of cold air and noisy energy. Sarah followed, her arms laden with jackets and backpacks. Derek came in last, tapping away at his phone, barely looking up to say hello. I ignored the slight sting of that. It was Derek's way, always preoccupied, always a little impatient. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The boys chattered about school projects and soccer practice. Sarah told me about a new yoga studio opening downtown. I smiled, listening, refilling plates and pouring sweet tea, feeling that familiar, simple joy that came from seeing them all gathered around my table. At some point, I excused myself to retrieve the dessert. I had spent the morning whipping the meringue just right, making sure the peaks stood tall and proud, just the way Harold had liked it. As I returned to the dining room, I overheard Derek speaking in a tone louder than necessary, clearly meant to draw attention. "Guess we should be grateful it's not another one of her budget specials," he said with a laugh. "You know, the gifts you have to pretend you like because they look like they came from the clearance bin at the dollar store." The words hung in the air like a slap. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misheard, but the way Sarah pressed her lips together and stared down at her plate told me I hadn't. The boys giggled, not understanding but sensing the permission to laugh. Derek, still smiling, glanced around the table as if expecting everyone to join in on the joke. I set the pie carefully on the counter, my hands steady even though my chest felt hollow. I turned back, plastering a smile on my face that felt brittle, and quietly asked who wanted dessert. No one noticed the way my voice wavered. No one noticed anything at all. We ate the pie. We made small talk about weather and school and the latest Netflix series. I nodded at the right moments, laughed when it was expected, cleared plates and loaded the dishwasher with mechanical efficiency. By the time they left, with hurried hugs and half-hearted promises to call soon, the house felt colder than it had all winter. After the door closed behind them, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring out the window into the dark. The lemon meringue pie sat untouched, except for two thin slices. The chairs around the table still held the faint imprint of their bodies, the ghosts of a family moment that now felt like a memory from another life. I thought about every gift I had given them over the years. The down payment for their first home when Sarah had called me crying because the bank wouldn't approve the loan. The used car I bought for Derek when his broke down and they couldn't afford a new one. The checks slipped into birthday cards. The grocery store gift cards tucked quietly into Sarah's purse when I knew they were struggling. I hadn't done it for thanks. I hadn't done it for recognition. I had done it because they were family, because helping them had felt like breathing, automatic, necessary. And now, my life, my sacrifices, my love had been reduced to a punchline. I sat down at the table, my hands resting flat on the wood, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the full weight of that moment, the sadness, the betrayal, the realization that somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obligation. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily on. Outside, the stars blinked cold and distant. Inside, something quiet and resolute began to harden in my chest. They thought I would swallow the insult. They thought I would keep giving. They thought wrong. The next morning, I went about my routines, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I watered the potted plants in the living room, folded the laundry that had been waiting in the basket for days, and made myself a modest breakfast. Yet every movement felt detached, mechanical, as if I were only pretending to inhabit my own life. I replayed Derek's words in my mind over and over, the way a tongue probes a sore tooth. Each time, it stung a little more. I thought about the way Sarah had looked away, the way no one had corrected him, not even gently. I thought about how small I must have seemed to them in that moment, how disposable. I had heard mockery before, from strangers or acquaintances who didn't know better, but from my own family, from the people I had nurtured and supported and sacrificed for, it was something else entirely. It wasn't just a comment about gifts or money. It was a declaration. It was a boundary they had drawn without inviting me to the discussion. I spent the day cleaning the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors and polishing furniture until the wood gleamed and my back ached. It wasn't that the house needed it. It was that I needed it. The ritual of reclaiming my space, of wiping away the fingerprints of people who no longer valued what I gave. Later in the afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and a notebook. I stared at the blank page for a long time before writing a single word at the top: debt. I wasn't thinking of revenge. I wasn't thinking of cruelty. I was thinking of fairness, of accounting. After all, I had spent my life balancing ledgers, ensuring that every dollar and cent had its proper place. Maybe it was time I treated my family the same way I had treated my clients, with professionalism, with clear terms, with no room for assumptions. I listed everything out carefully, methodically. The $15,000 down payment for their house, the $8,000 for Derek's car when his transmission failed, the $5,000 I had given them when Sarah was laid off during the recession, the endless smaller sums, $500 here, $1,000 there, for medical bills, emergency repairs, unexpected expenses. By the time I finished, the numbers stared back at me like a silent accusation, not just the money, but the trust behind it, the belief that I was helping to build their future, never asking for repayment because love, I thought, didn't keep score. Apparently, I had been the only one who felt that way. As evening fell, I fixed myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the lights come on in the neighborhood houses. I imagined the conversations happening inside those homes, ordinary and mundane, full of small kindnesses and irritations. I wondered if anyone else ever realized how easily kindness could be mistaken for weakness, how the more you gave, the smaller you seemed to become in the eyes of those who took. That night, Sarah called. Her voice was bright, casual, as if nothing had happened. She asked if I wanted to come over next weekend, maybe bring a dish for the neighborhood barbecue they were hosting. I listened to her speak, feeling the distance in every syllable, the shallow familiarity that no longer fit between us. I told her I would think about it. I didn't mention the list. I didn't mention the hollow ache still sitting under my ribs. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time afterward, the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock my only company. In that darkness, a realization bloomed, slow and undeniable. I had been playing a role for years without realizing it. The good mother, the generous grandmother, the background figure who smiled and helped and gave without ever asking for anything in return. But roles, like debts, could be rewritten. They had laughed at my cheap gifts. They had forgotten that sometimes the most valuable gifts are invisible until they are taken away. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was awake, and I was about to remind them exactly how much I had given, and how easily it could be undone. The morning after Sarah's phone call, I woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting long, pale streaks across the bedroom ceiling. I lay there for a moment, staring at the familiar cracks in the plaster, the ones Harold used to promise he would fix but never quite got around to. Those cracks felt oddly comforting now, imperfections that had stayed true even when everything else had shifted. I rose and dressed slowly, pulling on an old cardigan with loose threads at the elbows. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floors under my feet. I made a strong pot of coffee, poured a cup, and carried it with me to the kitchen table where my notebook still lay open from the night before. The word debt stared up at me, stark and bold. I turned the page and began again, this time creating a ledger the way I would for any new client. Clean columns, clear headings, precise dates and descriptions. I started at the beginning. The year Sarah and Derek got married, they struggled. They had dreams bigger than their wallets, and Harold and I had been only too happy to help. I wrote down the $10,000 we had given them as a wedding gift, intended originally for a honeymoon they never took. Instead, they put it toward rent, groceries, and their first broken down car. Then came the down payment on their house. They had found the place on a quiet street with a crumbling porch and peeling paint, but good bones, as the realtor had said. They didn't have enough saved, not even close. I remembered sitting at this very table, writing a check for $15,000, feeling only warmth at the idea of giving them a foundation to build their life on. Next, the small business venture Derek had started, a cafe downtown that was supposed to be their big break. He needed investors, he said. Banks wouldn't lend to him without substantial backing. I co-signed the loan and contributed $25,000 of my own savings to get them started. I hadn't even hesitated. I jotted it all down carefully. The medical bills when Sarah broke her ankle slipping on ice and insurance didn't cover the full surgery costs, $200. The replacement vehicle after Derek totaled his car and needed reliable transportation to keep the cafe running, $8,000. The groceries during the long months when Derek's business barely broke even, small amounts each week, $100 here, $200 there, accumulating into thousands over time. The Christmas gifts, the birthday checks, the emergency cash slipped quietly into Sarah's hand when I noticed her stressed expression and tight smiles at family gatherings. I worked through the morning, my coffee growing cold beside me, the list growing longer and longer with every line. By noon, I had an exact figure, over $75,000. $75,000 that I had given them across the years, believing it was a gift of love, an investment in their happiness. I leaned back in my chair, the pen slipping from my fingers. It was staggering, not just the money, but the generosity that had been taken for granted, folded into the background of their lives like wallpaper they no longer even noticed. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the ease with which they had dismissed it all, the casual cruelty of that laugh at the dinner table, as if I were some well-meaning fool handing out trinkets while they built their world on the foundation I had quietly paid for. I closed the notebook and stared at it for a long time. This wasn't just a list anymore. It was a record of my place in their lives, and a reckoning of how easily they thought they could erase it. I went to my filing cabinet in the study, pulling out old folders thick with receipts, loan agreements, bank transfers. I wasn't as sentimental as Sarah believed. Years of bookkeeping had taught me that good intentions were no excuse for sloppy records. I sorted through the paperwork meticulously, creating a second file labeled Evidence. I scanned copies into my computer, organized them by year, saved backups onto a flash drive I wore around my neck. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the kitchen walls in deep amber, I had a dossier strong enough to stand up in any court if it came to that. I wasn't preparing for a legal battle, not yet, but I knew now that the rules had changed. No more silent giving, no more hoping they would see the unseen. I had given them years of grace. Now I would give them the truth, written in numbers they could not laugh away. I packed the documents carefully into a leather folder, the same one Harold had given me when I started my bookkeeping business. It felt fitting somehow that it would hold the last accounting of a chapter I had never wanted to end this way. The night came in quietly. I sat by the window with a fresh cup of tea, the list heavy in my lap, and watched as the world outside settled into sleep. Inside, I stayed wide awake and ready. I spent the next morning in town, moving through errands with a focus I hadn't felt in years. The old bank building loomed ahead, solid and indifferent under the overcast sky. I tightened my grip on my leather folder and pushed open the heavy glass door. The familiar scent of paper, ink, and faintly metallic air washing over me. Inside, I asked to speak with Mr. Conway, the branch manager who had helped Harold and me refinance our home decades earlier. He was older now, hair thinner and slower on his feet, but he still carried himself with a kind of cautious dignity that I respected. He ushered me into his office, a modest space filled with framed certificates and a battered oak desk. I laid the documents carefully on the desk and explained in quiet, deliberate words that I wished to sever all co-signed financial arrangements tied to Sarah and Derek. I provided evidence of my original contributions, the informal loans disguised as gifts, the down payment assistance that had been documented at the time, but never formalized as a true transfer of ownership. Mr. Conway listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his fingers steepled thoughtfully under his chin. When I finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly. "It will cause complications," he said. "I understand," I replied. "Family often expects silence in these matters." "I've been silent long enough," I said. He nodded again, more firmly this time, and began drafting the necessary paperwork. I signed forms to remove myself as a guarantor from Derek's business loans, effective immediately. I filed a notice of claim on the house down payment, establishing that it had been a loan, not a gift, thereby voiding certain favorable terms they had enjoyed with the mortgage lender. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the ripples would start soon enough. After the bank, I walked 2 blocks down to a small law office, tucked between a florist and a dry cleaner. I had made an appointment with a real estate attorney, Ms. Reyes, a sharp woman in her 40s with a reputation for discretion and tenacity. She reviewed the copies of receipts and bank transfers I had brought, nodding approvingly at the neatness of my record keeping. Together, we drafted formal letters of demand addressed to Sarah and Derek, itemizing the amounts owed and the terms under which repayment would be expected. There would be no threats, no insults, only facts laid out in the clear, emotionless language of contracts and obligations. Ms. Reyes asked if I wanted to proceed to court immediately or allow them a chance to resolve the matter privately. I chose the latter. One last chance for them to treat me with the respect I deserved before the law took over where kindness had failed. Leaving the office, I felt a strange mix of sadness and empowerment. I wasn't proud of what I had to do. No mother dreams of drafting legal notices against her own child. But pride wasn't the point anymore. Survival was. Dignity was. I returned home just as the afternoon sun began to fade behind a thick curtain of clouds. I made myself a sandwich I barely tasted, then sat at the dining room table staring at the 2 envelopes I had prepared, one for Sarah and one for Derek, their names written in my careful, even handwriting. The same handwriting that had once filled birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes tucked into lunchboxes. I thought about not sending them. I thought about tearing them up and pretending the past week had never happened. But I couldn't unhear Derek's laugh. I couldn't unfeel the hollow in my chest every time I replayed Sarah's silence. I sealed the envelopes. At the mailbox, I hesitated for just a moment, the cool metal door open in my hand. Then I slid them inside and let the door slam shut with a solid, irrevocable clang. The first step had been taken, a step not of revenge, but of reclamation. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was simply taking back what was mine. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I felt something bloom deep inside me, tentative and stubborn. Freedom. It didn't come with parades or applause. It came quietly, wrapped in resolve, steady as the ticking of the old clock in my hallway. And I welcomed it. The first ripple arrived 3 days later. It was a voicemail from Sarah, her voice tight, almost breathless, asking if I could call her back. I listened to the message twice before placing the phone back on its charger without responding. I needed more than frantic words to undo what had been done. By the end of the week, the ripples had grown into waves. I received a letter from their mortgage company, a carbon copy sent for my records, notifying all parties that their home loan was now under review due to the recalculation of the original down payment source. The favorable interest rate they had enjoyed, secured partially by my involvement and good credit history, was no longer valid. The next call came from Derek. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He launched straight into accusations, his words hot and fast, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, how I could ruin their lives over a stupid joke. I listened, silent, letting him expend all his venom. When he finally sputtered to a stop, I told him calmly and evenly that all actions had consequences, even the ones people thought would be forgotten as soon as they were spoken. He hung up without another word. I sat at the kitchen table afterward, staring out at the rain sliding down the window pane. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It wasn't victory. It was mourning. mourning the trust that had been broken, the invisible bridge between us that had finally collapsed under the weight of years of one-sided giving. By the second week, the cafe that Derek had worked so hard to build began to show cracks. Vendors, alerted by the changes in financial backing, grew cautious. New terms were imposed, higher interest, upfront payments. Without my silent endorsement behind him, Derek found himself exposed, vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sarah called again, this time crying. She begged me to reconsider, to meet and talk it through. She said the boys missed me, that it wasn't fair to punish them. Her voice cracked in that familiar way, the same way it used to when she was small and scraped her knee or lost her favorite toy. It almost worked. Almost. But I remembered standing at the kitchen sink just weeks before, watching her laugh at Derek's joke, watching her let the moment pass without so much as a glance in my direction. She had been old enough to know better. She had been old enough to choose differently. I didn't answer her calls after that. I focused instead on my life, my garden, my books. I took long walks around the neighborhood, feeling the seasons begin to shift, the air growing crisper. I sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars prick holes in the dark velvet sky, thinking about the long journey that had brought me to this quiet, painful clarity. One afternoon, as I was returning from the library, I saw Derek's truck parked outside my house. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking the long way home, but I was tired of running from discomfort. I walked straight up the path, my keys jangling faintly in my hand. He stood as I approached, arms crossed over his chest, anger radiating off him like heat from sun-baked asphalt. "You're going to destroy everything we built," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, but a man who had mistaken generosity for obligation, kindness for weakness. I saw a man who had never truly grown into the space that had been prepared for him. "I built it," I said simply. He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Without another word, he got into his truck and drove away, tires spitting gravel behind him. The crisis deepened after that. Their mortgage company issued a formal demand for additional funds to cover the loan balance adjustment. Vendors cut ties. Sarah's cheerful social media posts grew fewer and far between, replaced with vague, sad updates about challenging times. I heard from mutual friends that they were considering selling the house, downsizing, maybe moving in with Derek's parents for a while. It wasn't what I had wanted, but it was what needed to happen. Some lessons I had learned only sink in when the ground finally gives way beneath you. In the quiet that followed, I found myself breathing easier. The grief was still there, heavy and familiar, but beneath it, something new was growing, a kind of peace, not the peace that comes from everything being okay, the peace that comes from finally, irrevocably choosing yourself. In the days that followed the collapse of their carefully curated lives, I found myself moving through my routines with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The air smelled crisper somehow. The simple act of walking through my home, touching the worn banister Harold had varnished by hand, felt like reclaiming something I had not even realized I had lost. I kept waiting for the guilt to find me. It didn't. Instead, something different settled into my bones, something sharper and cleaner, a kind of awakening that made the world look slightly different, as if the edges of things had been sharpened while I wasn't paying attention. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums in the living room, I came across a picture of Sarah as a little girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a lopsided paper crown and a grin that could melt the hardest heart. I sat back, the photo trembling slightly in my fingers. I remembered the party clearly, how she had insisted on making decorations herself, how she had sobbed when the cake collapsed in the oven, and how Harold had run out to the store to buy another one without a word of complaint. We had always been the safety net, the unspoken assumption that no matter what, we would catch her before she hit the ground. Maybe that had been the mistake. I thought about every time I had written a check, offered a loan, bailed them out quietly so they wouldn't feel the sting of real consequences. I thought about how I had convinced myself it was love, and it was in its own way. But somewhere along the line, love had blurred into enabling, and generosity had hardened into silent expectation. I had trained them to see me as a resource, not as a person. The realization stung, but it also freed me. I was not responsible for the choices they made after accepting my help. I was not responsible for the entitlement that had festered in the absence of gratitude. I was not responsible for the fact that somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me altogether. They had seen only what I could provide. And when I stopped providing, they called it betrayal. I thought about Derek's face that day in the parking lot, the way his anger had shifted into something almost childlike when he realized the old rules no longer applied. I thought about Sarah's voice on the phone, trembling, reaching for the mother she had expected to always be there, no matter how little care or respect was shown. But life didn't work that way. Not if you wanted to keep your soul intact. I spent more time outdoors after that. I dug my hands into the garden soil, feeling the strength in my fingers return with every stubborn root I pulled free. I pruned back the rose bushes Harold had planted, watching them spring back stronger after each careful cut. Sometimes growth required a little brutality. Sometimes survival demanded pruning things that refused to bloom. I began to rebuild my days around what nourished me, not what drained me. I joined a book club at the library, where women my age gathered to debate characters and plot twists and laugh until the windows steamed. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, shaping clay with clumsy fingers, marveling at how satisfying it felt to create something messy and imperfect and entirely my own. At night, I lit candles and listened to music, real music, not the half-heard noise that used to fill the background of frantic Sunday dinners. I read novels that made me cry, and memoirs that made me laugh, and poems that left me sitting in the dark, feeling the strange, beautiful ache of being fully alive. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't broken. I wasn't less because they had decided I was inconvenient. I was whole. I thought often about the word cheap, the careless insult Derek had thrown across the table that day, how small he had tried to make me feel, how wrong he had been. Because the truth was, my gifts had never been cheap. They had been priceless: my time, my love, my sacrifices, my belief in a future I would never fully get to enjoy. I wasn't ashamed of any of it, but I wasn't going to offer it blindly anymore. There was power in knowing where your worth began and where it ended. There was peace in choosing who deserved your tenderness and who did not. By the end of that month, I had written a new list, not of debts owed, not of wrongs suffered, but of things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, experiences I wanted to claim for myself without apology. It wasn't a bucket list. It was a declaration, a promise to the woman I had been, to the woman I was still becoming. The awakening was quiet, but it was complete, and this time no one could take it away from me. The calls started coming more frequently, first from Sarah, sometimes twice in one day, her voice increasingly desperate in each message she left, then from Derek, though his messages were different, short, angry bursts demanding to know what I thought I was doing, how I could be so heartless after everything we had been through together. I didn't return the calls. It wasn't that I didn't hear the sorrow or the fear in Sarah's voice. I heard it clearly, slicing through the bravado they had wrapped themselves in for so long. I heard it, and still I stayed silent. Because I knew now that sorrow alone wasn't enough to rebuild something that had been dismantled piece by piece over years of careless entitlement. One afternoon, Sarah showed up at my doorstep. I had just returned from the farmer's market, a bag of fresh tomatoes and sweet corn slung over my arm. She was standing there in the driveway, arms crossed over her chest, the way she used to stand when she was a teenager, trying to act tough after getting caught sneaking out of the house. She looked smaller now, thinner, the strain of the last few weeks carved into the lines around her mouth and eyes. I set the groceries down carefully on the porch before meeting her gaze. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded and stepped aside, letting her into the house. She moved like someone walking through a memory, her hand grazing the edge of the hall table, her eyes lingering on the framed family photos lining the staircase wall. I wondered if she was remembering all the Sunday dinners, the birthday parties, the countless cups of coffee shared across this same worn kitchen table. We sat down across from each other, a familiar tableau now weighted with unfamiliar tension. She started slowly, tears welling in her eyes almost immediately. She apologized, said the things she thought I wanted to hear. She admitted that Derek's joke had been cruel, that she should have spoken up, that they had taken my help for granted. She promised they would change, that they would be better, that they just needed a little more time. I listened. I let her speak every word. When she finished, I folded my hands in my lap and told her the truth. I told her that forgiveness was not the same thing as forgetting, that rebuilding trust was not a promise made in a moment of desperation, but 1,000 small actions stretched over months, years. That I was willing to have a relationship with her again, but it would not be the same relationship she had always expected. It would not be built on silent giving and grateful taking. It would be built on respect, and respect had terms. I told her the financial matters would stand as they were, no rescinding of demands, no wiping of slates. What was owed would be paid, in full or not at all, but it would no longer be ignored. Sarah cried harder than pleading, asking if we couldn't just start fresh, like pressing a reset button on a board game. But life wasn't a game, and some moves couldn't be undone. After she left, Derek tried his hand at persuasion. He sent flowers, expensive ones in grand arrangements that looked more like apologies meant to be seen than felt. He left notes that swung wildly between anger and remorse. He even showed up once, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, staring at the house, but never making it to the door. I watched him from behind the curtains, feeling nothing but a strange kind of pity. He still didn't understand. None of their gestures came from acknowledgement. They came from fear. Fear of losing comfort, fear of losing safety, fear of losing access to what they had never really appreciated. Not once did either of them ask how I was feeling. Not once did they ask what I needed. It was still about them, their pain, their struggle, their inconvenience. I stayed silent. I stayed still. I tended to my garden, pulling weeds with slow, deliberate hands. I baked bread from scratch for the first time in years, the yeasty smell filling the house with a warmth that felt like belonging. I took myself to movies, to concerts in the park, to coffee dates with new friends who asked about my day and listened without expectation. Every now and then, Sarah would send another message, each one shorter than the last, each one tinged with a little more bitterness, a little more resignation. She was beginning to understand, I think, in those final failed attempts to pull me back into the role they had assigned me long ago. I was not returning to it. I had outgrown it. The last message came on a Tuesday evening, simple and stark. "We miss you, but I guess you've made up your mind." I didn't reply, because she was right. I had made up my mind. And for once, I wasn't making it up to please anyone else. I was making it up to save myself. The quiet that followed was not the oppressive kind I had once feared. It wasn't a silence that pressed down on me, making the house feel bigger or emptier. It was a living, breathing thing, a silence that gave me space to remember who I was before I became a shadow behind other people's needs. Each morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, not to the buzzing of a phone filled with demands disguised as affection. I began my days not with lists of errands for others, but with slow stretches of sunlight creeping across the kitchen floor and the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the pot. I spent long afternoons in the garden, digging my hands into the rich earth, feeling the pulse of life beneath my fingertips. I planted rows of tomatoes and peppers, lined the walkway with lavender, filled the front yard with wildflowers that welcomed bees and butterflies. The garden became a place of quiet prayers, each seed I placed in the ground a promise to myself to keep growing, no matter what had been lost. Often while I worked, my mind wandered back to Harold. I remembered the way he used to whistle under his breath when he mowed the lawn, the way he always left his boots outside the door even when it rained. I could still see him at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper with his glasses perched low on his nose, tapping his fingers against the ceramic coffee cup he loved. His absence was still a hollow place inside me, but it no longer hurt in the same raw way. It had softened, becoming part of the landscape of my days, much like the old oak tree in the yard, weathered, familiar, and strong. Harold had been my first great love, the man who taught me that partnership was about lifting each other up, not weighing each other down. For a long time after he passed, I thought I would never find that kind of companionship again. I had resigned myself to living out my years alone, wrapped in memories, but life, it seemed, wasn't finished surprising me. It started simply, as most important things do. An old friend, Walter Mason, who had lost his wife around the same time I lost Harold, began stopping by after his morning walks. At first, it was just for a quick cup of coffee, a shared laugh about the stubborn squirrels raiding my bird feeders. Then came longer visits, evenings spent talking on the porch about books we were reading, memories of a town that had changed around us while we stayed mostly the same. Walter was different from Harold in many ways. He was quieter, more deliberate with his words. Where Harold had been quick to joke and tease, Walter listened with a patience that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I missed. Being with him wasn't about filling the silence, it was about sharing it. One afternoon, as we sat watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of pink and gold, Walter took my hand in his. His palm was rough, his grip gentle. He didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. I felt the offer there, silent and steady, an invitation not to replace what had been lost, but to build something new atop the life I had so carefully reclaimed. In a few months, we decided somewhat shyly to get married, not because we needed to, not because life felt incomplete without a ring, but because we wanted to mark the new chapter we were beginning together. The ceremony would be small, just a few close friends in the garden I had planted with my own hands. No grand speeches, no white dresses, just promises whispered into the summer air and held tightly between two people who knew what it meant to have lost and found themselves again. As the plans came together, I found myself smiling more often, Not the polite, practiced smiles I had worn for years, but real ones that warmed me from the inside out. Occasionally, I would still see a missed call or a message from Sarah, but they no longer pulled at me the way they once had. I wished her well, silently, and then turned my attention back to the life unfolding in front of me. One evening, wrapped in a shawl against the cool breeze, I sat on the porch with Walter beside me. The stars blinked awake in the dark velvet sky, and the wind chimes sang its gentle music above our heads. I thought about Harold and smiled, knowing he would have approved. I thought about Sarah and Derek and felt no bitterness, only a distant kind of gratitude for the painful lessons they had taught me. This was my life, not a second-hand existence borrowed from someone else's dreams, not a waiting room for other people's priorities. It was mine, and it was beautiful. For the first time in a long, long while, I was not looking back. I was looking forward, toward a tomorrow I was no longer afraid to meet, toward a life that was not about loss, but about love, bold, imperfect, and entirely mine.